I want you to understand something before I tell you this. A crown guard does not move. That is the whole thing. That is the entire point of him. You can stand in front of one for an hour and shout and dance and wave your hand an inch from his eyes, and he will not so much as twitch. The boys who come to Ashcombe Palace on a school trip think it's a game. They try everything. And the men in those bearskin caps just stare straight ahead at a point somewhere past your shoulder, like you're not even there. People think it's about looking grand. It isn't. It's about something older than that. When a man puts on that uniform and takes his post, he stops being himself for a while. He becomes the wall, the thing that does not bend. And the not moving, the absolute bone-deep stillness of it, that's the promise. It says, nothing is wrong here. It says, you are safe because I am so calm I have turned to stone. So when I tell you that on a warm afternoon in the second week of June, in front of more than 200 people, Corporal Elias Crane broke ranks and moved, I need you to feel how impossible that was. I need you to understand that in 11 years of service I had never seen it. Not once. Not when a tourist fainted. Not when a horse bolted. Not when it rained so hard the water ran off the brims of our caps in sheets. A crown guard does not move. Elias moved. And I have spent the rest of my life telling people why. Let me set it for you properly. Because the where and the when matter here more than you'd think. Castlereagh isn't a big kingdom. You could drive across it in a long morning. But it's old and it's proud, and the royal family there is loved in a way that's hard to explain to outsiders. Ashcombe Palace sits at the edge of the capital, Eldonbury, where the city softens into parkland. Pale stone, a long forecourt behind tall iron railings, and gardens out the back that run down to a lake. In summer, the whole place smells of cut grass and roses and the warm dust the tourists kick up on the gravel. I was a foot guard of the King's Own. 11 years. By the June I'm telling you about I was a sergeant, which mostly meant I stood a little to one side and watched the younger lads and worried about their boots and made sure nobody locked their knees and went over in the heat. That happens, you know. Lads faint. The trick is you bend the knees just slightly, keep the blood moving, and you never, ever let it show on your face. Elias Crane was one of mine, sort of. He was older than the others, must have been 34, 35, and he'd come to the guard late, after years doing something else. Driving lorries, I think, up north. He had hands like a man who'd worked, and a flat, quiet way of talking, and he didn't say much. The younger lads liked him because he never made them feel small. When one of them got a dressing down, he'd find them later and just stand near them for a bit, not saying anything, until they felt human again. He had a daughter, I knew that much. There was a photograph he kept folded in his breast pocket against regulations, and once early on I'd seen him touch his chest with 2 fingers before going on parade, the way some men cross themselves. A little girl with gappy teeth and her hair in 2 short plaits. He never talked about her mother, and I never asked. There are things you don't ask in that life. That's the man. Hold him in your mind, steady, quiet. The last man on earth you'd expect to make a scene. Now the day. It was a garden reception. One of those summer things the palace puts on half public, half private. Charities mostly. The kind of event where a few hundred people who have done good work somewhere get to stand on the lawn in their best clothes and drink something cold and meet the family. There were nurses there. I remember that. A whole cluster of nurses from a children's hospital, in dresses they'd clearly bought for the occasion, holding their glasses too carefully, like they were afraid of dropping them on the royal grass. The weather was the kind you pray for and almost never get. High blue sky, a little breeze coming up off the lake that moved the flags on the roofline, warm but not cruel. The roses were at their absolute best, that 1 week a year when they're almost too much, and the gardeners had been out since 4 in the morning. I was posted near the colonnade, the covered walk that runs along the back of the palace where it opens onto the gardens. From there you could see most of the lawn, the little knots of guests, the serving staff in their white jackets threading between them, and the family when they came out, moving slowly through the crowd the way they do, a few words here, a few words there, never rushed, never lingering too long anywhere. Princess Aderyn came out around 3. I should tell you about her, because she's the heart of this. She was married to the crown prince, the king's eldest. She'd married in maybe 6 years before, and the kingdom had taken to her completely. She wasn't born royal. Her father ran a veterinary practice in some small town near the western coast, and she'd trained as a teacher, and there was always something of the schoolroom about her, in the good way. She crouched down to talk to children at their level. She remembered names. She had a way of listening that made the person in front of her feel like the only one on the lawn. She was quiet, though. That's the thing people didn't always see. Behind the warmth there was a shyness she worked hard to manage, and on the bad days you could catch it, a stiffness around the eyes, a beat too long before she found her words. The crown prince was away that week, some official business overseas, so she'd come to the reception alone, doing her duty, standing in for the family on a hot afternoon in front of 200 strangers with that shyness sitting on her shoulders and nobody beside her. I noticed it because noticing is the job. You learn to read a crowd, a room, a lawn. You learn to see the wrongness in a thing before it becomes a problem. And I remember thinking as she moved out among the nurses and the charity folk, that's a brave woman doing this on her own. I had no idea yet what she was going to need bravery for. The trouble had a name, and the name was Casimir Vane. You won't have heard of him, and that's by design. He spent his whole life trying to be heard of and never quite managing it, which I've always thought was the rot at the center of him. The king's second wife, Queen Margaret, had been married before long ago to a businessman who died when Casimir was a boy. So Casimir was the queen's son, and he lived in the palace's world, and he wore good suits and went to the right things. But he was not royal, not a drop. He had no title that meant anything. The lord people called him was a courtesy, a soft thing, the kind of label that gets handed to a man so nobody has to have an awkward conversation about why he's there. And he knew it. That was the whole of him, really. He knew that every person bowing to the princess, every flag, every soldier on the forecourt, none of it was for him, and none of it ever would be. His mother had married into the thing he wanted, and the best he could do was stand near it and pretend the warmth was his. Men like that are dangerous in a particular way. Not loud, usually, just sour, always measuring, always looking for the smaller person in the room so they can feel taller for a moment. He'd been drinking. I want to be fair and say I didn't see how much, but I saw enough. There's a looseness that comes over a certain kind of man after the third or fourth glass, a slackening in the face, and Casimir had it. He'd been moving through the reception in a way the rest of the family never did, too fast, talking too long, laughing at his own things while the guests smiled the smile people give when they're trapped. A footman tried to slow him down. I saw it. The lad came up with a tray and a quiet word, the way they're trained, offering him something to eat, which is the polite code for "You've had enough, sir. Let's get some bread in you." Casimir waved him off so hard the glasses rattled. That was maybe 20 minutes before it happened. Here's the thing about the stillness, and why what came next hit the lawn the way it did. We were everywhere, the guard, and nobody really saw us. That's part of it too. 200 people on that grass, and not one of them was thinking about the men in the red and the bearskin standing at the edges. We were furniture. We were architecture. A guest might glance at one of us, think postcard, and look away. They didn't think of us as men with eyes and ears and opinions and daughters in our breast pockets. Elias was posted at the foot of the colonnade steps, where the lawn began. The most photographed spot on the whole property, probably. He'd have been there since before the guests arrived. Stood at attention in the full kit in the warm sun, sweat running down inside that uniform, not moving, not drinking, not so much as shifting his weight. For hours. And he could see everything. That was the thing nobody thought about. From where he stood, Elias Crane had the best view on the lawn. He saw the nurses. He saw the princess crouch to talk to a little girl who'd been brought along by one of them. He saw her stand back up and press her hand flat to her stomach for half a second, that small bracing thing people do before she turned to the next group. And he saw Casimir Vane start to drift toward her. I saw it too from the colonnade, and I felt the first cold drop of it go down my back, because I knew that walk, loose and too straight at the same time, the walk of a man who's decided something and is about to be a problem about it. He reached her by the rose beds. There was a little open space there where the lawn curved around the flowers, and she'd ended up in it almost alone, just her, and one lady-in-waiting a few steps back, and a knot of guests close enough to hear but not close enough to be in it. The worst possible geometry, public enough to humiliate, private enough that nobody felt they could step in. I started moving along the colonnade, slow, casual the way you do, so as not to make a thing of it, a sergeant strolling, but inside I was counting steps and distances and thinking about how long it would take me to cross that grass if I had to. I couldn't hear all of it, wind and the murmur of the crowd and 40 feet of lawn between us, but I caught the shape of it and I caught his face, and the face told me everything. He was smiling. That was the worst part. He stood too close to her, closer than anyone is allowed to stand to her, closer than her own husband would stand in public, and he was smiling, and he was saying something low, and whatever it was landing. Because I watched the princess change. I watched the public smile she wore, the warm, careful one she'd had on all afternoon. I watched it freeze and then start to come apart at the edges. I watched her take a small step back, and I watched him close the gap again, easy as anything, like it was a dance he'd decided they were having. The lady-in-waiting moved forward half a step and stopped, because what do? He's the queen's son. You're a junior member of the household. You have no idea if stepping in will make it better or end your career. And the guests, they did the thing crowds do. They looked away. They found their drinks fascinating. 200 people and a wall of polite backs going up around her because nobody wants to be the one who saw. I was moving faster now. Not running, you don't run. Running starts panics, but moving, and I knew already I was too far. Then Casimir reached out and took her by the arm. I need to be careful telling you this part, because I've told it a lot of times over the years, and every time there's a danger of making it bigger than it was. So let me just tell you what I saw. He took her by the arm, just above the elbow, not gently. His fingers closed and I saw the fabric of her sleeve pull, and I saw her whole body go rigid, that full-stop stillness that comes over a person when something has crossed a line they didn't think anyone would dare cross. He was still smiling. He was saying something into her ear now, and she had turned her face away from him, away from the crowd, toward the rose beds, and even from 40 feet I could see her blinking too fast. She said something. I couldn't hear it, but I could read it off her shoulders. It was the polite thing. The let go please, the small managed sentence of a woman who has been trained her whole public life never, ever to make a scene, even when a scene is exactly what the moment is screaming for. He didn't let go. He laughed. I heard that. The laugh carried where the words didn't, and he gave her arm a little shake, a horrible, casual, possessive little shake, the kind you'd give a child who wasn't listening, and that was the moment. That was the precise instant the whole afternoon turned over. Because 40 feet away, at the foot of the colonnade steps, in the most photographed spot on the property, Corporal Elias Crane was watching it all. And every rule he had ever been given, every drill, every hour of standing motionless in the rain, every word about how a crown guard does not move, does not speak, does not exist as a man while he wears the cap, all of it was sitting on one side of a scale. And on the other side was a frightened woman with a man's hand closed around her arm, and not one soul in 200 lifting a finger to help her. I was still 20 feet away when Elias made his choice. I saw his head turn. A crown guard does not move. I have thought about that next half second more than any other moment of my life. Because that's all it was. Half a second. Less maybe. The time it takes a heart to beat once. But I've stretched it out so many times in my head over the years that it feels like an hour now, like I could walk through it room by room and tell you where everything was. Elias' head turned. That came first. Just the head, that small, forbidden movement, the one we drill out of a man until he'd sooner stop breathing than do it on parade. His eyes left the fixed point past the crowd that he'd been holding for hours, and they came down and across the lawn, and they landed on the rose beds, on the princess, on the hand around her arm. And then the rest of him followed. I want to describe it right because people always picture it wrong. They imagine a soldier charging, shouting, some big dramatic thing. It wasn't like that. It was worse than that somehow because it was so quiet. He came down off the bottom step in one movement. Not fast, not slow, just decided. The way water goes over the edge of a thing once it's reached the edge. His rifle stayed at his shoulder, dressed and proper, because even then, even breaking the deepest rule he had, some part of Elias Crane was still a soldier and was not going to disgrace the uniform by mishandling the weapon. I've always loved that detail. In the middle of doing the one thing he'd been told never to do, he did it correctly. His boots hit the gravel, and the sound of it, that single crunch, I swear half the lawn heard it. Not because it was loud, because it was wrong. It was a sound that wasn't supposed to be there. The way you'd notice a clock stopping in a room you didn't even know had a clock. People started to turn. Here's what I think nobody understands about that uniform until they've worn it. When you stand that still for that long, you stop being a person to the crowd. I told you that already. But the flip side of it, the thing that makes what Elias did so enormous, is that when one of those still figures suddenly moves, it's like a statue stepping off its plinth. It's like a building deciding to walk. The human eye is built to catch motion, and the whole point of the guard is that we are the things on the lawn that do not move. So when one of us does, every head snaps round whether the person wants to look or not. So as Elias crossed that grass, and it was, 15 yards, 20, a wave went through the crowd ahead of him. Heads turning, the murmur dropping, that ripple you get in a room when something is happening and nobody's said what yet, glasses lowering. A nurse near the front actually grabbed the arm of the woman beside her. And Casimir Vane, who had his back half turned to all of it, who was still leaning in over the princess with that smile on his face. Casimir didn't see it coming at all. But she did. The princess saw him. Over Casimir's shoulder, across the closing distance, she saw a crown guard walking straight toward her, full kit, rifle dressed, face like carved stone, and I will tell you something. I was watching her face, and the thing that went across it was not fear. For 1 second she didn't understand, and then she did, and what came up in her eyes was the most human thing I saw all day. It was hope. Naked, startled hope. The look of a person who has been completely alone in a crowd of 200 and has just realized, against all odds, that they are not. Elias stopped about a yard away. He didn't grab Casimir. He didn't shout. He didn't touch him at all, and I think that restraint is the only reason the story ended the way it did instead of in a much darker place. He just arrived. He planted himself, that whole red and black mountain of a man, half a step from Casimir Vane's shoulder, close enough that his presence finally registered, and he stood there. And Casimir felt it. You could see the moment it reached him, the way the back of your neck knows when someone's standing too close behind you. The smile slipped. He turned his head. And he found himself looking at a wall. I was close enough now to hear it. I'd come up fast on the other side, and a couple of the lads were converging too, reading the situation, but it was Elias' moment, and we all somehow knew to let it be his. Casimir looked Elias up and down. And here's the thing about men like Casimir, even rattled, even drunk, the first move is always contempt. It's reflex. He laughed, that same ugly little laugh, and he said, loud enough for the front of the crowd to hear, "What do you think you're doing? Get back to your post." Elias didn't move, didn't speak. "Did you hear me?" Casimir's voice went up. He still had hold of her arm. That was the obscene thing. He hadn't even let go. He was gripping the princess with one hand and waving the other at a soldier. Do you have any idea who I am? Get back to your post." And Elias looked at him. That was all. He turned that flat, quiet stare, the one I'd seen him use on nervous 19-year-olds to calm them down. He turned it full onto Casimir Vane, and he let it sit there. And in the longest 5 seconds I have ever lived through, Elias Crane did not say one single word. He just looked at the hand on the princess's arm, then back up at Casimir's face, then down at the hand again. You have to understand the discipline that took. Every fiber of that man wanted to say something. I knew Elias. I knew his temper ran deep and slow, and that when it came up like the sea. He had a daughter. He had a little girl whose photograph was folded against his heart at that very moment, and he was standing in front of a grown man putting his hands on a frightened woman in public, and every human instinct in him was screaming. And he said nothing, because a crown guard does not speak. He'd broken the rule about moving, he'd had to. There was no other way to cross the lawn, but he was not going to break the rule about speaking, not if he could help it, not if a look would do the job. And the look did the job. Because silence from a man that size in that uniform with that stare, silence is louder than anything. Casimir shouted at him, and Elias' silence just sat there absorbing it, soaking it up, and the more Casimir shouted the smaller he got. That's the strange physics of it. The noisy man shrank and the silent one grew, right there on the lawn in front of everyone. The crowd had gone dead quiet now. 200 people. You could hear the flags on the roof. You could hear, somewhere off by the lake, a bird carrying on like nothing was happening. And Casimir, finally, started to understand where he was. You could watch it arrive in his face. The realization that every single person on that lawn was now looking at him. That the soldier wasn't going to back down, wasn't going to be shouted into retreat, was simply going to stand there in silent judgment for as long as it took. That the careful, invisible thing he'd been doing, the leaning, the gripping, the low, cruel words that only she could hear had been dragged out into the blue afternoon light and laid on the grass for everyone to see. His hand opened. He let go of her arm. The second he let go, 2 things happened at once. The princess stepped back. Quick, instinctive, the way you pull your hand off a hot stove. She put a clear yard of English summer air between herself and Casimir Vane, and she pressed her freed arm across her body, holding her own elbow where his fingers had been, and she stood there breathing. And Elias, the moment her arm was free, the moment the threat was gone, Elias began to step back too. He'd done what he came to do. The wall was retreating to its place. He gave the smallest dip of his head toward the princess, barely a movement, the closest thing to a bow a man can manage with a bearskin cap and a rifle, and he started to turn back toward his post as though he might somehow undo the whole thing by returning to it. That's the part that breaks me, honestly. Even then, he thought he might just go back and stand still, and it would be as if it never happened, as if the rules might forgive him if he got back to the step quickly enough. But Casimir couldn't leave it. That's the kind of man he was. He'd been beaten, quietly, completely, in front of everyone, and a smaller part of a smaller man would have slunk off and been grateful no one called the photographers. But Casimir had been humiliated, and humiliation in a man like that doesn't go down, it goes sideways, and it looks for somewhere to land. "You'll be finished for this," he said, loud, to Elias back. "Do you hear me? You moved, you broke ranks. I'll have your job by tonight." You jumped up, and he said a word then, an ugly word, a word about where Elias had come from and what his father had probably done for a living, the kind of word that men like Casimir keep in a back pocket for exactly these moments. And Elias stopped. He didn't turn around. He just stopped with his back to Casimir, and I saw his shoulders rise once with a breath. And then into the silence came a voice, but it wasn't Elias. It was hers. "He was protecting me." The princess said it. Not loudly. She didn't have the kind of voice that does loud. But she said it clearly, into a lawn so quiet that quiet was all it took, and every word landed like a stone in still water. "He was protecting me," she said again, "from you." Casimir turned to her, and the smile tried to come back, the "let's not make a fuss" smile, the "it was all in good fun" smile, and she did not let it. She had stopped blinking too fast. Her chin had come up. The shyness I'd watched sit on her shoulders all afternoon had not gone away. I don't think it ever fully went away, but she had set it down for a minute because something mattered more. "You put your hand on me," she said, "in front of all these people, and not one of them was close enough or brave enough except him." She looked at Elias back and then back at Casimir. "So no, he will not be finished for this. You will not have his job. If anyone asks me what happened on this lawn today, I will tell them exactly what happened. I will tell them a soldier did his duty when a gentleman forgot how to be one. I have heard a great many speeches in my life. Trooping speeches, regimental speeches, men with medals saying grand things into microphones. I have never heard anything land the way those few quiet sentences landed on that grass." Because she was shaking. I could see it from where I stood. Her hands were trembling and her voice had a fine crack running through it the whole way. She was a shy woman who hated scenes, doing the single most frightening thing in her world, standing up in front of 200 people and a member of her own family by marriage and saying no, out loud, with everyone watching. And she did it anyway, for him, because he'd done it for her. What happened to Casimir Vane after that took about 90 seconds, and I almost feel sorry telling it, except that I don't. The thing about a crowd is that it's a coward right up until the moment it isn't, and then it turns all at once. For 20 minutes those 200 people had looked at their drinks and found the roses fascinating and let a frightened woman fend for herself. But the second she spoke, the second she gave them permission, the whole mood of the lawn turned over like a tide. I saw it move through them. The nurses first, God love them, who deal with bullies for a living and have the least patience for them. One of them said, clear as a bell, "Shame on you." Just that. And then it was everywhere, not shouting, nobody shouted, but a low cold murmur of disgust rolling toward Casimir from every direction. The sound of 200 well-behaved people deciding all at once that they had seen quite enough. Casimir Vane looked around the lawn for one friendly face and did not find a single one. And he did the only thing left to a man like that. He drew himself up, and he muttered something about the heat, and the wine, and a misunderstanding, and he turned and walked off across the grass toward the palace as fast as a man can walk while pretending he isn't hurrying. The crowd opened to let him through and closed behind him, and not one person said a word to him, and somehow that silence was the worst thing that could have happened to him. He'd spent his whole life trying to be seen. And in the end, the lawn punished him by refusing to. He went up the colonnade steps, the very steps Elias had come down, and through the doors, and he was gone. And then it was just the two of them, really, in the middle of all those people. The princess, with her arms still pressed across her body, and the soldier who had finally turned around. She looked at him. He looked at her. Two strangers in a way they'd never spoken, never would in any normal world, a princess and a foot guard from up north who used to drive lorries. The whole machinery of the kingdom existed precisely to keep a yard of polite air between people like them. Forever. And she crossed it. She walked the few steps over to him, in front of everyone, and she stood in front of Corporal Elias Crane. And she did something I had never seen anyone do to a crown guard on duty in 11 years of service. She thanked him. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Because what she said to him, and what he finally said back, the only words he spoke that entire afternoon, that's the part I most need to get right. And that's where I'll have to take up the last of it. She stood in front of him, and for a moment neither of them did anything at all. I think she didn't know the rules, not really, not the way we knew them. She didn't know that the man in front of her was, by every regulation in the book, not allowed to look at her, or speak to her, or acknowledge in any way that she existed while he stood his post. She just walked up to him the way you'd walk up to anyone who'd done you a kindness, because that's the kind of person she was. And now, she was standing close to a soldier who was staring rigidly past her shoulder at nothing, the way he'd been trained, because he had no idea what else to do either. So there they were, the two of them, marooned in front of 200 people, neither one knowing how this part went. And the princess, God bless her, she was still trembling. She gave a small laugh. A real one, watery and surprised, the kind that comes out of a person when the danger's past and the body doesn't quite know what to do with all the leftover feeling. And she said, very quietly, just to him, "I don't suppose you're allowed to talk to me, are you?" It wasn't a question, really. She'd worked it out. And something in Elias' face moved, not a smile. He'd never have allowed himself a smile on duty, but something around the eyes, a softening, the look a man gets when he's touched and trying very hard not to show it. He stared straight ahead, and he said, so low that I only just caught it from where I stood, "No, ma'am." That was it. That was the first thing. 2 words. A breach of every rule on top of all the others he'd already broken, and somehow the gentlest, most correct thing a man could have said. She laughed again at that, properly this time, and put her hand briefly over her mouth. Then she got serious. She looked at him, this big still man who'd come down off his step for her, and the lightness went out of her face and something steadier came into it. She said, "What's your name?" A pause, then still straight ahead. "Crane, ma'am, Corporal Elias Crane." "Corporal Crane." She said it carefully, like she was setting it down somewhere safe so she wouldn't lose it. "I want you to understand something. What that man said about your job, about finishing you, none of that is going to happen. I'll see to it myself. Do you understand me?" And for the only time in the whole business, Elias broke. Just a little, just for a second. Because here's the thing I hadn't told you yet, the thing I only learned afterward. Those weeks, Elias had been frightened about money. The little girl in the photograph, there'd been doctors. Something with her chest, an operation coming, the kind of thing the army insurance covered most of but not all of, and the not all of had been keeping him awake. He'd been doing extra duties. He'd been counting it out. The job he just risked, that Casimir had threatened to take from him in front of everyone, that job was the operation. That job was his daughter being able to breathe right. And he'd come down off the step anyway, knowing all of that. He'd looked at a frightened woman with a hand on her arm, and he'd put his own child's future on the scale, and he'd still moved. I didn't know any of that standing on the lawn. None of us did. We just saw a guard's composure flicker for half a heartbeat when a princess told him his job was safe. Saw his jaw work once, saw him swallow, and we thought, that's a proud man, hates being thanked. It was so much more than that. It was a man hearing that the thing he'd been most afraid of in all the world had just been lifted off him, by the very person he'd risked it for, and being absolutely unable to say so because he was on duty, and a crown guard does not weep on the lawn at Ashcombe Palace in front of 200 people. He just said, "Thank you, ma'am," straight ahead, stone again. But I saw his eyes shine. I'll go to my grave saying I saw it. She stepped back finally, gave him room. And then this is the part the photographs caught, the part that ended up in every paper in the kingdom the next morning. She turned to face the lawn to all those people who'd looked away, and she dipped her head toward Corporal Crane. A small bow, a princess bowing to a foot guard. It lasted a second, but the message of it went round the world. Because the whole order of that place, the whole invisible architecture I told you about, the yard of polite air that's supposed to keep a princess and a soldier forever apart. She folded it up and set it aside, in public, to say with her body what she'd already said with her voice. This man matters. What he did matters. I will not have it forgotten. And then the lawn did the thing that still puts a lump in my throat all these years later. It started with the nurses. Of course it did. One of them began to clap slowly, almost shyly, and then the woman beside her, and then it spread. And within about 10 seconds 200 people were applauding a single soldier standing rigidly to attention by the rose beds, refusing to acknowledge a word of it, staring straight ahead at his fixed point with his jaw set like granite and his eyes, I promise you, shining. He never moved again, not for the applause. He'd moved once that day when it counted, and now that it was over he had gone back to being the wall, and nothing on earth was going to shift him a second time. Which, somehow, made the clapping louder. There's an after to all this, and I'll tell it quickly, because the heart of the thing is already told. Casimir Vane never came back to a public engagement. The story got out. These things always get out, and a lawn full of nurses is not a lawn that keeps quiet. And within a week, the palace had quietly let it be known that Lord Casimir would be spending more time away. Abroad, they said. He drifted off into the kind of comfortable nowhere that people of his sort drift into, with money and no purpose, and as far as I know he's still out there somewhere, telling whoever'll listen that it was all a misunderstanding on a hot day. I expect fewer and fewer people listen each year. The lawn's punishment turned out to be permanent. He spent his life wanting to be seen, and in the end the kingdom simply stopped looking at him. Elias kept his job, more than kept it. There was a commendation, quiet, internal. The regiment doesn't make a circus of these things, but it was real, and it sat in his file. And I know for a fact it was read out the day he was made sergeant the following year. The princess was true to every word. I heard, though Elias would never confirm it, that a letter arrived at his home some weeks after, in a hand that wasn't a secretary's, asking after a little girl by name. The operation went ahead that autumn. The little girl with the gappy teeth and the 2 short plates did fine. She'd be a grown woman now. I like to think she knows the story. I like to think someone told her what her father did on a warm afternoon in June before she was old enough to remember. Elias served another 9 years. He never once talked about that day, not to me, not to anyone, not even when the younger lads, who all knew the story by then, it had become a kind of legend on the parade square, tried to get him going about it. He'd just give them that flat, quiet look and tell them to sort their boots out. The most he ever said, the one time I pushed him on it, late, after a long duty, was this. I'd asked him how he could have done it, knowing what the job meant, knowing about his girl, how he could have taken that risk. And he was quiet for a long time, and then he said, I've got a daughter, and one day she's going to be out in the world somewhere on her own in a crowd full of people, and I have to believe that if a man ever puts his hand on her like that, somebody nearby is going to do something about it. He looked at his boots. I just decided I wasn't going to be one of the ones who looked away. I think about that a great deal now that I'm old and out of the uniform. About all the people on that lawn. 200 good, decent, ordinary people, nurses, charity workers, people who'd spent their lives helping others, and how every single one of them for 20 long minutes looked at their drinks and let it happen. Not because they were cruel, because they were polite, because they were afraid of making a scene, afraid of being wrong, afraid of the man's title and their own smallness. The same fear that kept the princess quiet was the fear that kept the whole lawn quiet. It's the most natural thing in the world, looking away. It's almost always the easiest thing to do. And then one man didn't. One man who had more reason than anyone there to keep his head down, a job he couldn't afford to lose, a child who needed him, a rule book 100 years deep telling him to stand still. One man looked at the thing everyone else was looking away from, and he came down off his step. He wasn't a prince. He wasn't a lord. He had no title and no fortune and no power except the power any of us has, which is the power to decide in the moment it matters that we will not be one of the ones who looked away. People ask me when I tell this story what the lesson of it is, as if it needs one. But if it does, it's this. The bravest thing I ever saw a soldier do, he did without a weapon and without a word. He just moved. In a place built entirely around the rule that he must never, ever move, he moved because someone needed him to, and that was the end of the matter. A crown guard does not move. Elias Crane moved. And every time I tell it, I hope it makes one more person somewhere a little less likely to look away.